awkward transition here, but I'm your speaker for tonight, or today, this morning. So thank you for joining. So I'm going to give you a little bit about my background, a little bit about who I am, because I think it's important that we learn more about each other, not only just as an ethical society, but just in general, to build those connections, and to share our stories. Each of us has a story that I think is extremely important that we share. And I don't say that easily, because there's a time, or there has been a time, most of the time, that I didn't think my story really mattered that much. Or why would anybody really want to listen to my story? Who am I? You know, I'm kind of nobody. I'm just average. I don't, you know, I'm not a, you know, sports athlete or celebrity. Why would anybody care about little old me and my story? But the more that I interact with other people, and the more I listen to other people's stories and am extremely interested in theirs, I came to realize that, you know what, my story is important too, because it's my story. And your story is important because it's your story. And we all have something to learn and share from one another, experiences in our past, our hopes of, and our dreams for the future. We are not all just isolated individuals living on our own little islands, but we are a community. And we need to learn about each other and to grow with one another. And I think in doing so, it invites other people to want to hear our stories, and lets people know that we are a place that we value their story, and that we want to hear from them and learn from them and know them, and share with them. So I titled it "What's Past is Prologue." I'm not sure where I came across that quote for the first time. It's from a Shakespearean play. I don't like Shakespeare at all. Never have. Never liked reading it. Never got it. Outside of, you know, Romeo and Juliet, you know, or just watching, you know, more contemporary versions of it. But that quote has come to mean a lot to me. What's past is prologue. In other words, our history, our past, has set the stage for where we are. For the longest time, I would have thought that my past is dictating my future. And my past, you know, in a sense that I couldn't escape it. But when Antonio, I think it's Antonio, is saying it to Sebastian, what he's saying at is where we've arrived to, this thing we're about to do, which is actually about to commit murder. Our past has led us up to this point, but our past isn't dictating this point. It's not commanding that we go through with this. We still have a choice. Our future is still left to be decided by us. So let me set the stage a little bit about who I am. If there's three things you need to know about me, it's that I'm a lover of history, a lover of questions, and a lover of reading. However, there is some irony or cognitive dissonance with those three things that we'll see in a little bit, because there was one area of my life where I didn't question where I was. And my love of reading only allowed me to go so far in what I read. So my prologue, my past, the stage. For all as I can remember, I grew up in the church. As my earliest memory is pretty much going to church at some point. We did it every single Sunday, the 8 o'clock service. I grew up in an Episcopal church, or or the Church of England. But it's known as the Episcopal Church here. It was the 8 o'clock service. We always sat in the back pew, and the service was always an hour. There was no music. It was a no frills. It was just the service as it's written out in the Book of Common Prayer, which is kind of the manual or handbook of the church. To this day, if I would go to a church that still uses the Book of Common Prayer, I could recite everything that needs to be said. I had to have it memorized. I was an acolyte or altar boy. If you're familiar with the Episcopal Church, it's very similar to the Catholic Church. We had a community communion where everybody would come up to the front. It was a community cup. I got to the point where I would administer the cup or the communion wine. I can remember age 14, 15, then needing to consume that wine. Because in the Episcopal Church, and similar to the Catholic Church, once that wine has been blessed, it's no longer just wine. There's something special about it. There's fancy theological terms for it.
Consubstantiation.
Correct. Now, that's the Catholic one. In the Episcopal Church, it's not quite that. So in the Episcopal Church, transubstantiation means basically the elements of the bread and wine have literally become the bread or the body and blood of Christ. So it's no longer just bread and wine. There's something mystical happened. The Episcopal Church doesn't quite go that far. So they're somewhere in the middle. They believe in consubstantiation. All that to say is, though, you can't just throw it away. So the excess bread has to be saved till the following week, and the excess wine has to either be saved for the next week, consumed, or put down a special sink which has a wooden pipe that goes directly to the ground. In my church, we had to consume it. Our priest was actually a recovering alcoholic, and he couldn't do it. So it was left up to the chalice bearers to actually consume it. I got good, actually, at making sure that I did not have much left over, because I didn't want to necessarily consume it. It was terrible wine. It was terrible. Burned going down like you couldn't believe. There were certain priests, though, that I knew they were going to fill that thing up, and oh my word, now I've got this chalice I had to consume at the end. I was very conservative back then. I can still remember having cassette tapes of William Bennett, Kemp, I can't remember his first name, and Newt Gingrich that I would listen to regularly. 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, I listened to Rush Limbaugh. This is the late 80s, early 90s, so I grew up under Reagan. I was conservative in high school. I remember giving a term paper in my junior English class that was against abortion. I remember getting an F on the paper and believing wholeheartedly that it was because my pro-choice teacher did not like the position I took. It never dawned on me that actually I just wrote a bad paper. I was sure that it was her, because her and I would have multiple interactions throughout English class debating one another, where I disagreed with her. That's who I was growing up. At some point, I became an evangelical Christian, born again, Bible believing, all those terms that are used. That was me. I went to Lancaster Bible College, was very reformed in my theology. I was a Calvinist, if that means anything to anybody. I can explain that later. But that was my theological framework. And from there, I became a youth pastor. I was a youth pastor off and on for 12 years. Throughout the time, there were some moments of crisis in my faith. Mostly it pertained to how the church was organized or ran. It was more the church politics and dynamics just frustrated me. At some point, though, things changed. And allow me to share my screen. I've got two pictures I'd like to share. For most of my adult life growing up, and especially as being a youth pastor, I allowed other people to dictate my expectations. And not just other people, but God. For me, my belief, what was taught to me, was that I was a sinner, that I was a bad person deep down, that there was nothing I could do to change myself, no matter how hard I tried, and no matter how hard or how good I was, that I was still a sinner. I was still bad. There is a verse that is misused out of the Old Testament that basically says, our good deeds are like filthy rags to God. And the Hebrew word for filthy rags is actually better translated as menstrual rags. So the idea is that no matter how good I am, no matter how right I do something, I'm still deemed unclean, not to be touched, that I'm dirty and bloody and like a menstrual rag. For all of that time, that was what I was told I was. And that if it wasn't for God, that I would be nothing more than that. Those were the expectations that created a cage for me. And not only that of how that looked at my self-worth, but then what I wanted to do in life could only be dictated by God. So it was always my desire to seek out what He wanted me to do. Now, it never crossed my mind how this God, who is supposedly the God of, all billions of people, know exactly what we all are supposed to be doing. And heaven forbid if we don't do it. But somehow God's will would always be done, regardless if I was following it or not. And that was just what it was supposed to be. So those were the expectations that I lived around, and that was the cage that I lived my life. And for the time, I was accepting of that, which gets me to the irony of the fact that I'm a lover of questions. I never questioned that. It never dawned on me to question if I was a good person or not, or what I should be doing in my life. My only question was always to seek out God and what He wanted me to do. And yes, God was always a He. At some point, I was confronted with this image, and more importantly, actually, with a person who came to me and revealed to me, they were a youth in my youth group, and she shared with me that she was bisexual. And she shared that with me after I had just given a 4-week study on why homosexuality was wrong. And she came up to me and, in the most loving way, said to me that she knew that I cared about her, but that she wanted me to know that she was bisexual. And that floored me. Not that she was bisexual. In fact, that didn't even bother me at all for whatever reason. What floored me was that she trusted to share that information with me, that she was willing to share her story, even though she knew that I might not be the safest person to tell. And I came across this image somehow at some point. And this captured exactly who I was at that time. I was more inclined to study, to read, to figure out my theology, and to know it precisely, to be able to defend it, to teach it, to instill it into others. Yet all around me, I didn't see the harm and the suffering that was happening. Because unlike ethical society that speaks of deeds before creeds, I was more concerned about the doctrine over my deeds. I believe that if I were to just know it completely and to be able to defend my doctrine, that eventually I would be living it out. And I realized that when she shared with me her story, and I started really looking at my theology, that I wasn't living it out as much as I thought I was. And that what was happening within, especially the evangelical church, was an attempt to spiritualize these words of Jesus and of the Bible to almost make them neuter. They didn't really mean anything anymore. Because if they were only just spiritual words, then what happened here and now didn't matter. It was only about getting to the end, about making sure that I was deemed worthy enough to get to heaven. So the present sufferings weren't that much of a reality. They were just something to endure to make sure that we could get to heaven. So the focus was always about teaching the right doctrine so that somebody would believe the right thing so that they would be then accepted into heaven. Again, so it was believing that Jesus died for us. And if you believed that, then God would accept you. And when you died, you would be welcomed into heaven. Yet everything going on around us, the poverty, the suffering, the injustices, those were just considered temporary, not to worry about that. The more important thing was the eternal. And slowly that changed for me. Slowly that no longer made sense to me. I could not any longer look past the suffering that was happening. And the more that I became connected to and grew relationships with people in the LGBT community, people in our community that didn't necessarily go to church, that were suffering in poverty, came to realize I would never invite any of those people to this church that I actually was on staff with and was earning my income from. There was no way I would invite them there because it was not a safe space for them. I didn't know what they would hear. I didn't know what would come out of anybody's mouth. I didn't know how they would react to the pregnant teenager. In fact, I did, because a girl in our church got pregnant. She was not given a baby shower. She was not given diapers or help. Unlike me and our family, who at that time was going on our third child, who didn't necessarily need all those things anymore, who had a support system in place. Yet we were ushered with baby showers, with diapers and all this love that was shown to us. And yet here's a family whose daughter was pregnant, but because she was pregnant out of wedlock, she was not worthy to receive those things. There was no baby shower for her where all the church members came and had a cake and celebrated and joy and was, joyous in this new life that was coming. I would not invite any of my gay friends to that church because I didn't know what they would hear on a Sunday morning. I didn't know what damnation they would be told, or how terrible they were, or how horrible they were seen in God's eyes because of their sin. And my eyes became open to what were we doing? What was I really believing in? And that started a time and a period for me of what now known in most Christian circles as deconstruction. I started looking deeply at each part of my theology that I had built up, just like a building, just like a foundation. And brick by brick, I started taking it away and saying, no, there has to be something else. There has to be a better way. And for a while, I was content in just being a more progressive Christian, a more liberal Christian, taking these same words and saying, no, the conservatives twisted them. This is a bad interpretation. Here's something better. And that worked for a time. I moved from what I said as Reformed theology to what is now known as liberation theology, which is heavy in the Black church and in the South American church. And that's looking at the suffering of the people and that God came to liberate the people. And it's more concerned about social justice and liberating people from the injustices. And while that I found beneficial and helpful, and it made me want to hold on to some of my faith at a time, the more I kept looking, the more I kept reading, and the more I kept questioning, I realized that some of the problem wasn't that I just wasn't looking at Christianity in the right way. It was that I really wasn't looking at Christianity for what it was, and for faith for what it was, and the reality that I don't need a God to be a good person, and that my ethics doesn't need to be defined by some outside force that is dictating to me this is what I needed to do. But my ethics all along needed to be seeing what was happening as I see people live out their lives, and that we needed to question the systems and the structures that are out there, and that there has to be a better way. And that ultimately there are good people that are living out and doing way better good who have absolutely no faith or no belief at all. One of the people, and I'll try to wrap this up shortly, was a friend of my wife's. We had hosted a young girl from Haiti who came here because she needed medical help. She had a condition called arthrogryposis. Basically, her muscles weren't formed correctly, and for her, her one leg she could not straighten, and one she couldn't bend, and she actually got around on her hands and basically just crawled everywhere and drug her legs everywhere she went. She was an amazing girl, amazing what she could accomplish for the condition that she was in. We got involved with other people that took care of or had children that had arthrogryposis, and my wife met somebody through Facebook that lived in California. And one of the things that she did is she would go, when she went to the grocery store, she would always buy extra groceries, and she would put together care packets or kits, backpacks, that she would put toiletries, socks, food, shelf-stable food supplies in. And she would keep these in her, the trunk of her car. And as she traveled, if she saw a homeless person or somebody that was, down on their luck, she would give them a backpack. And she would just hand it to them and just say this was for them and go on her way. I was amazed at that. I thought, wow, what an awesome, and at that time, quote unquote, ministry that she was doing. Only then to learn out that she was a Wiccan, and that she was an atheist. And I'm like, oh my word, here she is doing way more good, not believing in a God than most people are who do believe in a God. And just bit by bit, I started to question more my beliefs and what it meant to do good, to where I got to the point of, rather than just deconstructing my faith, it was a total dismantle, to where I would say that I do not believe in a God. But more importantly than that, it's really not about that question if a God exists or doesn't exist for me. It's, what are we doing with it? What are you doing with your life? It truly is living out deed before creed. So if you don't believe in a God, or you do believe in a God, great. But what are we doing? What are we doing to take care of the people around us, to see the social injustices that are around us all the time, to work at creating a more just and vibrant and better society around us? And to me, it doesn't really matter if you believe in a God or not. What are we doing to be ethical? Hence why I became a part of the ethical society, because in all the ways that I saw the non-theists living their lives out and what they expressed, it was the ethical society that I felt best captured living out that ethical life, that really wanted to look at what it means to be ethical, more so than just having morals. And I do think there's a difference between the two. But then how do we live that ethical life out? And how do we help one another live that out? Part of coming to the ethical society, though, was I kind of stumbled into it because I was looking for a group of non-theists, atheists, humanists, whatever. And the only one I could find was the Lehigh Valley American Humanist Association. Lehigh Valley is nice and all, but that's quite a drive away. And here we are in COVID, and I'm not able to meet with people anyways. I needed something a little bit more local. So thanks to Google, and I'm not exactly sure what terms I put in, but here comes up Susquehanna Valley Ethical Society. And I'm like, great, there's something in my backyard in Lewisburg that's not in a big city, and humanist and non-theist, especially in this area that is very much Christianized and religiousized and all that. And then I'm like, well, wait, what's an ethical society? How's that different from a humanist organization? And that just led me one thing into another, which where comes my love of reading comes back again always. I'm like, fine, give me a book, let me read about it, let me find more books. Started listening to podcasts, finding more and more and more. And so came to know Patty, got to meet, through Patty, she, I think, introduced me to Hugh Morales, who introduced me to Jay, who introduced me to yet another person, and has led me to meeting all of you wonderful people. And what an awesome journey it is. And I'm excited to be a part of and to be with you. So in conclusion, let me say, in sharing my story, thank you for taking the time to want to hear it, to caring about it. But more importantly, let me conclude with saying that your story is important. We all need to hear your story and what brought you here to the Ethical Society, and where you are at. And part of that will be next week. So I will be facilitating, I'll give you a little sneak peek to next week, so you guys can prepare a little bit. I want you guys, we're going to try something neat or different and get into little breakout rooms to where you share with one another your story. So two of you will kind of get paired up and just share a little bit about your story with each other. And then we'll come back together and share everybody's story kind of together. My grandmother has a saying, that I love. It's a little bit religious, but she says, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, so that we can hear twice as much as we say. So I think part of sharing our story is also making sure that we're listening to everybody else's story. So while I've monopolized this time this morning, next week, it's all going to be on you, that we get to listen to everybody else's story, to hear what you have to say. And hopefully that helps us to then also learn how we listen to other people's stories out there, especially in our society today, where, you know, we have people from different walks of life, different viewpoints. How can we best hear their story to understand them, rather than just trying to tell them that they're wrong or that they need to believe something different or think another way? I think we need to engage other people to hear their story, to hear them, and allow that to help us build relationships with one another, that we then kind of rub off onto them, and they hear our story and what it means for us. So again, thank you. Sorry I spoke longer than I anticipated, but that's the retired pastor, preacher in me. One quick